You see, when we say God turns impossibilities into testimonies, what we're really saying is that the very thing that makes you want to quit is the very stage God chooses to perform on. Think about it. If it were easy, if it were simple, you wouldn't need a miracle. The reason it looks so impossible is because it's designed to showcase His glory. That's why He let you face what you're facing right now, because when He brings you out, you won't be able to say, "I did it." You'll have to say, "Only God could have done it." The impossibility is not a punishment. It's the setup for the story you're going to tell, the testimony that's going to inspire somebody else. What looks like your dead end is really the beginning of your evidence that God still works miracles. Miracles begin where human logic ends, and that's why so many people miss them. Because they keep trying to calculate what can only be created by God. Logic says there's no way out, but faith says, watch what God is about to do. Logic says the numbers don't add up, but faith says 5 loaves and 2 fish are more than enough when placed in the Master's hands. You see, God doesn't need your math, your plan, or your strategy. He just needs your surrender. The reason He waits until it doesn't make sense is because if you could figure it out, you'd take the credit. But when the solution comes from nowhere, when the breakthrough shows up after every door has been shut, you'll know it wasn't your wisdom that did it. It was His power. That's the beauty of a miracle. It begins where your understanding runs out. Every miracle starts with a problem, and that's why you can't despise the problems in your life. The problem is the platform for God's power. Look at the Red Sea. Moses wasn't standing there with options. He was standing there with no way forward and an enemy closing in. That wasn't the end of the story. That was the setup for God to split the waters. Look at David. He didn't walk into the battlefield with strength or weapons that made sense. He walked in with a slingshot and a faith that said, God is bigger than this giant. The problem created the opportunity for the miracle. Even the 5 loaves and 2 fish, nobody saw enough food to feed a multitude, but God saw a moment to reveal His abundance. So if you're staring at a problem today, don't call it the end, call it the birthplace of your miracle. Your current struggle is preparation for your breakthrough. And that's why you can't quit in the middle of it. What feels like pressure is actually training. What feels like resistance is building your strength for the very thing you've been praying for. You see, before God trusted David with a crown, He first trusted him with a sling in the field. Before Joseph ever wore the robe of authority, he wore chains in a prison cell. The struggle was never meant to destroy them. It was meant to shape them, and the same is true for you. The battle you're in right now is sharpening your faith, stretching your endurance, and preparing you to carry the blessing when it comes. Because God will never put a miracle in unprepared hands, He uses the struggle to make sure you're ready for the breakthrough. Stop magnifying the problem and magnify God. That's one of the greatest shifts you'll ever make in your life, because whatever you magnify becomes bigger in your sight. Think about it. When you take a magnifying glass and place it over something small, it suddenly looks large enough to dominate your vision. The problem didn't change in size, your perspective did. That's what some of you are doing with your challenges. You've put the magnifying glass of your focus on your bills, your sickness, your rejection, your brokenness. And now it feels bigger than everything else in your life. But the truth is, the problem isn't as powerful as it appears. You just keep giving it the spotlight. The children of Israel did the same thing when they spied out the land God had already promised them. 10 of the spies came back talking about giants. They said, "We were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in theirs." Notice what happened. They magnified the giants and minimized their God. They forgot the same God who parted the Red Sea, who drowned Pharaoh's army, who sent manna from heaven, was the same God who told them, "This land belongs to you." Their fear didn't come from the size of the giants, it came from the size of their perspective. They magnified the obstacle instead of magnifying the one who is greater than every obstacle. Now, let's flip it. When David faced Goliath, everybody else was talking about how big the giant was. But David came with a different mindset. He said, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Do you hear that? David magnified his God above the problem. While everyone else measured Goliath's strength against their weakness, David measured Goliath's weakness against God's strength. And that's why he could run to the battlefield with a sling and a stone, because he understood that no problem is bigger than his God. Let me ask you something. What are you magnifying? Are you magnifying your sickness so much that you've forgotten He is Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals you? Are you magnifying your lack so much that you've forgotten He is Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides? Are you magnifying your storm so much that you've forgotten He is the one who speaks peace, be still, to the winds and waves? When you magnify the problem takes over your faith. But when you magnify God, faith takes over the problem. See, the devil knows he can't stop God's plan for your life. What he tries to do is shrink your faith by magnifying your problems. He'll whisper, "Look at the bills stacking up. Look at the doctor's report. Look at how long it's been. Look at how far you've fallen." And if you keep focusing on that, you'll forget that the one who promised is faithful. That's why worship is so powerful. It's the act of magnifying God. When you worship, you remind your soul God is bigger, God is greater, God is faithful, God is still in control. And let me tell you this, magnifying God doesn't mean denying your problems. Faith is not denial. Faith is choosing to acknowledge the reality of the problem, but then declaring a greater reality, that God is sovereign over it. Daniel didn't deny the lion's den. He just believed his God was greater than the lions. The 3 Hebrew boys didn't deny the fiery furnace. They just believed their God was greater than the fire. Jesus didn't deny the cross. He just believed the resurrection was on the other side. That's what happens when you magnify God. You stop letting the problem write your ending, and you start letting God write His promise over your situation. Let me go even deeper. When you magnify the problem, you build your prayers around fear. Your prayers sound like, "Lord, please don't let me fail. Please don't let me lose. Please don't let me suffer." But when you magnify God, your prayers shift into faith. They sound like, "Lord, I thank you that victory is already mine. I thank you that healing is flowing through my body. I thank you that provision is already on the way. I thank you that this storm is temporary, but your word is eternal." You see the difference. Magnifying the problem makes you beg. Magnifying God makes you believe. And here's the part I love: God responds to faith. He doesn't respond to fear. He doesn't respond to doubt. He doesn't respond to worry. He responds to faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please Him. And faith is impossible to grow if all you do is magnify the problem. Faith grows when you magnify God. That's why the psalmist said, "Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt His name together." When you magnify him, you shift your vision. And when you shift your vision, you shift your expectation. And when you shift your expectation, you open the door for miracles. So maybe today, the mountain in front of you hasn't moved because you keep talking about how heavy it is, how high it is, how hard it is. But Jesus didn't say talk about the mountain. He said speak to the mountain. He said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, be thou removed and cast into the sea. Notice the difference. Talking about the mountain magnifies the problem. Speaking to the mountain magnifies your God. And that's why some mountains are still standing in your life. They've been magnified by your words instead of moved by your faith. You've got to shift your language. Stop saying, this is too hard. This is too much. I can't make it. I'll never overcome. And start declaring, greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. If God is for me, who can be against me? My God shall supply all my needs according to his riches in glory. That's what happens when you magnify God with your words. You put his power above your problem, and that shifts everything. And let me remind you, magnifying God doesn't just change your perspective, it changes your posture. When you magnify the problem, you walk defeated, shoulders heavy, spirit crushed. But when you magnify God, you walk with authority. You hold your head up. You start expecting doors to open. You start expecting miracles to manifest. Because you know your God is bigger than anything you're facing. That posture of faith attracts favor, and favor produces breakthroughs. So today, make a choice, because it is a choice. You can either magnify the weight of your problem, or you can magnify the greatness of your God. One will drain your faith, the other will release it. One will keep you stuck, the other will move you forward. One will keep you complaining, the other will keep you praising. And when you choose to magnify God, you'll discover that the problem wasn't as big as it seemed, and God was bigger than you ever imagined. When faith collides with God's power, impossibilities bow. That's the divine equation that never fails. Faith by itself is powerful, but when you connect it with God's unlimited power, it becomes unstoppable. It's like plugging a lamp into the socket. You can have the lamp, you can have the bulb, you can have the switch, but until it's connected to the source, it produces no light. Faith is that connection. The moment you plug your faith into the power of God, darkness flees, chains break, and miracles ignite. Think about the woman with the issue of blood. For 12 years, she magnified her problem, running from doctor to doctor, spending everything she had, getting worse instead of better. But the day her faith collided with the power of Jesus, everything changed. She said to herself, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I will be made whole. That was faith in action. And when she touched him, Jesus said, who touched me? Power has gone out from me. Do you see it? Her faith collided with his power, and the impossibility of 12 years of sickness bowed in an instant. That's what happens when your faith refuses to quit. Blind Bartimaeus was sitting on the roadside, and the crowd told him to be quiet. But he kept shouting, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. The more they tried to silence him, the louder his faith became. And when Jesus heard him, his power collided with Bartimaeus' faith, and the blindness that seemed permanent had to bow. Because when faith collides with power, the impossible loses its grip. Even Peter, when he stepped out of the boat, wasn't walking on water. He was walking on a word. Jesus said, "Come." And Peter believed that word enough to put his feet on top of what should have drowned him. That's what faith does. It turns sinking places into standing places when it connects to God's power. As long as his faith was locked on Jesus, the water couldn't swallow him. And I'm telling you, when your faith is locked on Jesus, the storms of life cannot sink you. Now, don't miss this. Faith doesn't make God move. Faith positions you to receive what he's already moving. The power is constant. It never runs out. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead is still available right now. But faith is the key that unlocks it in your life. Without faith, the power is still real, but it won't flow through you. With faith, the power flows freely, breaking every chain, healing every wound, opening every door. So, here's the truth. Impossibilities don't bow to your effort. They bow to your faith colliding with his power. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to have the courage to believe. Because when heaven and earth meet in the heart of a believer, there is no sickness that can't be healed, no debt that can't be canceled, no addiction that can't be broken, no dream that can't be resurrected. Faith brings you to the place where God's power shows up, and when the two collide, the impossible has no choice but to move. The God you serve is still the same today. And that's where so many people get it twisted. They think miracles were just for the Bible days, like God retired after the book of Revelation was written. But let me remind you, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If he was a healer then, he's a healer now. If he was a provider then, he's a provider now. If he opened prison doors then, he can open your doors now. His character hasn't changed. His power hasn't diminished. His authority hasn't expired. The same God who spoke light into darkness is the same God who can speak hope into your situation today. Think about it. When he brought the children of Israel out of Egypt with signs and wonders, he wasn't doing that just to show off. He was revealing his nature as a deliverer, and if he delivered then, he still delivers now. When he walked with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, he was revealing himself as a protector. And if he protected them in the flames, he'll protect you in the fire you're walking through right now. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, he was revealing himself as the resurrection and the life. And if he could call Lazarus out of a tomb, he can call your destiny out of whatever grave life has tried to bury it in. Some people act like God's power is on a timeline, like it expired with the apostles. But the truth is, if God ever did it once, he established that he can do it again. The reason testimonies matter is because they are proof that God is still in the business of being God. If he's done it for somebody else, that's evidence he can do it for you. That's why you've got to stop disqualifying yourself from miracles by saying, that was back then, or that was for them. No, God is no respecter of persons. What he does for one, he makes available for all who believe. The problem is not that God's power has weakened. The problem is that our expectation has. Somewhere along the way, we started lowering the bar, praying safe prayers, expecting small outcomes, preparing ourselves for disappointment instead of preparing ourselves for victory. But God is not limited by our low expectations. He's limited by our lack of faith. That's why Jesus could do no mighty works in his hometown, because they didn't believe. They saw him as ordinary, and when you see God as ordinary, you will miss the extraordinary he wants to release in your life. So if you really believe he's the same God, then you need to start expecting him to move the same way. Don't just read about miracles, prepare to experience them. Don't just admire what he did for somebody else. Position yourself for what he's about to do for you. Because the same power that parted the Red Sea is still flowing. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is still alive inside you. The same authority that shut the mouths of lions is still available to silence every enemy standing against your destiny. And here's the good news. You don't have to beg him to be who he already is. You don't have to convince him to do what he's always done. He hasn't changed, he hasn't retired, and he hasn't lost a step. He's still the miracle worker, still the way maker, still the chain breaker, still the promise keeper. The same God who was enough back then is more than enough right now. Your story isn't finished, and that's what the enemy doesn't want you to realize. He wants you to think that the chapter you're stuck in is the end of the book. But he's a liar. God is the author and the finisher of your faith, which means he holds the pen, not your past, not your mistakes, not your failures, not your critics. The pen has never left his hand, and if the author is still writing, then the story isn't over. What you call the end is often just a comma in God's narrative. You thought it was a period, but God says it's just a pause before the next move. Look at Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, thrown into prison. From the outside looking in, it looked like his story was a tragedy, but the author wasn't finished. God was still writing, and when the page turned, Joseph went from the pit to the palace, from prisoner to prime minister. What looked like the end was actually the setup for the fulfillment of the dream God gave him as a boy. And that same author is writing your story right now. The enemy wants you to stop in the middle of the process. He wants you to quit when the pain is fresh, when the loss feels unbearable, when the failure feels final. But God says, keep turning the page. Because if you keep turning, you'll see that the valley is followed by the mountain. The storm is followed by the calm. The crucifixion is followed by the resurrection. Every dark Friday in your life is setting up a glorious Sunday morning. And here's the truth. The reason your story isn't finished is because God writes in layers. He takes what the enemy meant for evil and layers it into a greater good. He takes your pain and layers it with purpose. He takes your loss and layers it with restoration. He takes your brokenness and layers it with beauty. You can't see the masterpiece while the brush is still moving, but once the painting is complete, you'll understand why the strokes had to look the way they did. So don't you dare close the book on yourself. Don't you dare settle for a half-written story. God specializes in surprise endings, in plot twists that no one saw coming. That's why your testimony will be so powerful, because people thought they knew how your story was going to end, but God is about to flip the script. They thought you were finished, but God is about to reveal that you're just getting started. They thought your best days were behind you, but God is writing a chapter where your latter will be greater than your former. Doubt limits, but faith releases miracles. Doubt is like a ceiling you build over your own life, keeping you trapped under what you could have risen above. Doubt says, what if it doesn't work? What if I fail? What if God doesn't come through? But faith flips the question and says, what if it does work? What if I win? What if God shows up bigger than I ever imagined? Doubt shrinks your vision, but faith expands your horizon. Doubt ties God's hands in your situation, but faith gives him room to move. When Peter stepped out of the boat, it was faith that carried him across the water. The moment he magnified the waves and let doubt creep in, he began to sink. Doubt didn't change the power of God, it just disconnected Peter from it. But when his faith was locked on Jesus, he was literally walking on top of what should have drowned him. That's the difference. Doubt drags you under, faith lifts you above. The enemy's strategy is always to plant seeds of doubt, because he knows a little bit of doubt can choke a whole harvest of faith. He did it with Eve in the garden. Did God really say? That one question of doubt caused her to trade paradise for pain. He tried it with Jesus in the wilderness. If you are the Son of God. But Jesus fought doubt with the Word, and faith released power that even the devil couldn't resist. And I need you to hear me. Doubt may visit your mind, but don't let it take residence in your heart. Because the longer you entertain doubt, the weaker your faith becomes. Doubt tells you to play it safe, but faith tells you to step out and trust. Doubt tells you to lower your expectations, but faith tells you to stretch them higher. Doubt makes you rehearse all the reasons it won't work, but faith makes you declare the promises of God until they manifest. Some of you are standing at the edge of your breakthrough, but doubt has you frozen in fear. You're asking, what if I try and it fails? But God is asking, what if you try and I show you my glory? What if the business idea succeeds beyond your imagination? What if the door you're scared to knock on opens into the very opportunity you've been praying for? What if the prayer you're scared to pray is the one that unlocks the miracle you've been waiting on? That's why you've got to starve your doubt and feed your faith. You feed your faith by meditating on His Word, by rehearsing His promises, by remembering His past faithfulness. If He did it before, He can do it again. If He brought you out then, He can bring you out now. If He made a way back there, He can make a way right here. Faith says, I may not see it yet, but I already know it's mine. And when that kind of faith collides with God's power, miracles are released and impossibilities bow. Never give up on God's timing, because what feels like delay is often divine design. We live in a world that wants everything now, instant answers, instant breakthroughs, instant results. But God doesn't work on man's clock. He works on His own calendar, and when His timing shows up, no devil in hell and no system on earth can stop what He has already ordained. You may think you're late, but God says you're right on schedule. You may think it's over, but God says, I'm just getting started. Look at Abraham. God told him he'd be the father of many nations, but years went by with no child. In the natural, it looked like the promise expired. But in God's timing, Isaac was born, and the covenant was fulfilled. Look at Lazarus. Mary and Martha said, Lord, if you had been here, our brother wouldn't have died. They thought Jesus was late, but in reality, He was right on time. Because He didn't just want to heal Lazarus from sickness. He wanted to show His power by raising him from the dead. If He had come when they wanted Him, they would have seen a healing. But because He came in His timing, they witnessed a resurrection. That's what I need you to understand. God's timing is never about your comfort. It's about His glory. Sometimes He allows the waiting so that when the breakthrough comes, there will be no doubt who made it happen. Sometimes He allows the delay so He can grow your faith strong enough to carry the blessing. Sometimes He lets the door stay closed because He's building a bigger one that you never saw coming. You thought it was rejection, but it was really redirection towards something greater. And let me tell you this, every setback in God's timing is really a setup. Joseph spent years in a prison cell, forgotten by people he helped. But when God's timing showed up, he went from prisoner to prime minister in a single day. That's what divine timing looks like. It may feel like nothing is happening for years, then suddenly everything changes in a moment. So don't despise the waiting. Don't curse the delay. Don't let impatience rob you of your faith. Because when God says it's time, everything that's been held up will be released at once. The healing will manifest, the promotion will come, the breakthrough will break forth, the miracle will suddenly appear. And you'll realize that every tear, every delay, every sleepless night was working together for the moment when God's timing collided with your faith. And when that moment comes, no man, no system, and no devil will be able to hold back what God has ordained for you. So hear me on this: God has never stopped being the God of miracles, and He has never stopped being the God of the impossible. The same God who parted the Red Sea, who raised Lazarus, who fed the 5,000, is the same God working in your life right now. What looks too hard for you is easy for Him. What feels delayed is right on time in His plan. And what seems broken beyond repair is just waiting for His touch. All He's asking is that you believe, that you trust, that you refuse to let doubt rob you of what He promised. Because the truth is this: if you don't quit, you can't lose. With God on your side, every impossibility is just a miracle in disguise. So lift up your faith, hold on to His word, and walk into your miracle season knowing nothing is impossible with God.